I was 27 when I first noticed it happening. My friend Marcus and I were sitting in this cramped coffee shop downtown, talking about his relationship troubles. Again, for the third time that week. He'd been with Emma for 2 years, and according to him, she was the source of all his problems. She's so controlling, he said, stirring his coffee with unnecessary force. Always questioning where I've been, always wanting to know my plans. It's like she doesn't trust me at all. I nodded along, but something felt off, because the Marcus I knew, he was the one who'd show up unannounced at Emma's work, who'd go through her phone when she wasn't looking, who'd get upset if she made plans without consulting him first. And that's when it hit me. Marcus wasn't describing Emma at all. He was describing himself. Carl Jung would have recognized this immediately. He called it projection, the unconscious act of throwing our own unacknowledged traits onto other people. And according to Jung, there's no behavior that reveals a weak person faster than chronic projection. Maybe you've seen this too. The friend who constantly complains about how fake everyone is, while putting on a different personality, depending on who they're with. The colleague who's always talking about how lazy the team is when they're the one missing deadlines. The family member who claims everyone else is too sensitive while exploding at the smallest criticism. Jung spent decades studying this phenomenon, and what he discovered was both fascinating and unsettling. He realized that what we can't stand in others is often exactly what we can't accept in ourselves. But here's where it gets really interesting, and where Jung's insight cuts deeper than most people realize. Projection isn't just about pointing fingers. It's about power, or rather, the lack of it. Think about it this way. When you project your own traits onto someone else, you're essentially saying, "This problem exists outside of me, therefore I have no power to change it." It's a psychological sleight of hand that keeps you stuck while giving you someone to blame. Jung wrote about a patient once, a 45-year-old man who'd suffered from what Jung called a compulsion neurosis for 25 years. This man had become completely cut off from the world, lost in his own projections. When Jung tried to help him see how his own actions contributed to his isolation, the patient said something that stayed with Jung forever. "But I can never admit to myself that I've wasted the best 25 years of my life." That's the real tragedy of projection. It's not just that we misperceive others, it's that we rob ourselves of the chance to grow. I remember watching Marcus continue this pattern for months. Every conversation became an opportunity to catalog Emma's flaws, to build a case for why his unhappiness was her fault. And the more he projected onto her, the more isolated he became, not just from Emma, but from himself. Jung described this process with haunting accuracy. The effect of projection is to isolate the subject from his environment, since instead of a real relation to it, there is now only an illusory one. Projections change the world into the replica of one's own unknown face. Your own unknown face. That phrase still gives me chills, because that's what projection really is. It's turning the world into a mirror of everything you refuse to see about yourself. And the weaker your relationship with your own shadow, the more distorted that mirror becomes. But Jung didn't just diagnose the problem. He offered something much more valuable, a way out. He talked about what happens when you start to withdraw your projections, when you begin to see that the traits you despise in others might actually live inside you too. It's uncomfortable, sure. It can feel like everything you thought you knew about the world is falling apart. But here's what Jung discovered. The people who could do this, who could own their projections and integrate what he called their shadow, these people became stronger, not weaker, more real, not less. They developed what Jung called conscious recognition and consideration, which he believed was essential for any genuine human relationship. I think about this whenever I catch myself getting particularly annoyed by someone, like last week when my neighbor was being inconsiderate by playing music too loud. My first instinct was to focus on how thoughtless he was, how he never considers others. But then I caught myself. When was the last time I'd been thoughtless? When had I prioritized my own comfort over someone else's peace of mind? The answer wasn't pretty, but it was real. And that's the thing about projection. Once you start seeing it, you can't unsee it. You begin to notice how often your strong reactions to others are really invitations to look inward, how your criticisms of others are often descriptions of your own unacknowledged behavior. Jung believed this was one of the most important skills a person could develop, not because it makes you a better person in some moralistic sense, but because it makes you a freer person. When you're not constantly trying to manage and control what you see out there, you have so much more energy available for your actual life. Marcus and Emma did break up, by the way. About 6 months later, Marcus started dating someone new, Jessica, and within a few weeks, he was having the exact same complaints. Jessica was controlling, untrusting, demanding. The names changed, but the story stayed the same, because that's how projection works. It's not really about the other person at all. It's about the internal drama you're not willing to face. Jung put it this way: everything that irritates us about others can lead us to an understanding of ourselves. But here's what I've learned. Most people don't want to understand themselves. They want to understand everyone else. They want to figure out why their boss is so difficult, why their partner is so needy, why their friend is so dramatic. The strong person does the opposite. They ask, what does my reaction to this person teach me about myself? What am I not willing to see? It's not an easy question, but it might be the most important one you ever ask. I think about Jung's patient sometimes, the one who couldn't admit he'd wasted 25 years of his life. What would have happened if he'd been able to own his projections earlier? What would his life have looked like if he'd developed the courage to face his own shadow? We'll never know. But we can ask the question about our own lives. What are you projecting? What traits do you consistently notice and criticize in others? What patterns keep showing up in your relationships, regardless of who you're with? These aren't comfortable questions, but they're the questions that separate the strong from the weak, the conscious from the unconscious, the free from the stuck. Jung spent his entire career studying human psychology, and he came to believe that our capacity for self-awareness, particularly our willingness to own our projections, was the single most important factor in determining whether we'd live authentic, connected lives or remain trapped in what he called the cocoon of our own illusions. Maybe you're thinking this doesn't apply to you. Maybe you're convinced that your complaints about others are legitimate, that your criticisms are warranted. And maybe they are. Sometimes people really are difficult, thoughtless, or unkind. But Jung would ask, even if that's true, what does your particular sensitivity to these traits reveal about you? Why do these specific behaviors trigger such strong reactions? The weak person stops at the first answer. Because they're wrong. The strong person goes deeper. And what does my reaction teach me about myself? That's the difference. That's the behavior that instantly reveals whether someone has done the hard work of self-examination or whether they're still living in the projection booth, watching a movie of their own unacknowledged traits play out on the screen of other people's lives. I still think about Marcus sometimes. Last I heard, he was engaged to someone new. I hope he's found what he was looking for, but I suspect that unless he's learned to turn the camera around, unless he's developed the courage to face his own reflection, he'll keep finding the same problems in different people. Because that's how projection works. It's not about them. It's never really about them. It's about the parts of yourself you're not yet brave enough to meet. And Jung believed that this meeting, this integration of the shadow, wasn't just possible, but necessary. Not because it makes you perfect, but because it makes you whole. The question is, are you strong enough to look?